so bear with us for that. Okay, then if I can move on to introduce Hannah to the discussion on Britain. She's going to speak for an hour, or perhaps less. She told me, let's be optimistic. And then after that, we will have discussion until 5:30. Okay, if I can introduce Hannah then. Thank you.
Okay, comrades, after that very enthusiastic introduction, we started today with a discussion on the world, which is absolutely right. This discussion is going to concentrate on Britain. And here as well, then we are on the cusp of a turning point, a change in the situation. And inevitably, in the discussion that we're going to have, comrades will contribute on the struggles that you're involved in now, in your trade unions, your communities, and so on. And that's absolutely correct, that's vital to this discussion. But we think it's also important that we try to look a little way ahead and to see what is going to take place, what the effects of a recession or economic slowdown will be specifically in Britain in general, but particularly on the consciousness of the working class. And we would add, there have been no formal amendments to the British Perspectives document proposed to the Congress this weekend from branches. But that doesn't mean that comrades shouldn't feel free to raise any points of difference, of emphasis, additions or subtractions that they think they should go into the document as a part of this discussion. Now, it's quite a young Congress we've got today. Well, there's a kind of age gulf, actually. Part of it's quite an old conference, but more than a third of the Congress is very young. And what that means is probably more than a third of the people in this room today have had no experience directly themselves in their conscious lives of a recession. Because we've had economic growth for the last 15 years in Britain. So the discussion that we're having is inevitably a little bit abstract, perhaps for some of our young comrades. I was speaking at a meeting in Yorkshire recently, and a youngish comrade gave a very good contribution on the world economy, but in passing he said in it, because of casualisation, because young people are already in low-paid jobs, poor housing and so on, I don't think a recession will make much difference to young people in Britain. His approach is perhaps moderate compared to the feeling of most young people who are not political at the moment. We've had anecdotal evidence of young members talking to their friends and so on, that they even imagine that they might do all right out of a recession. Because perhaps house prices will fall, and they'll finally be able to get on the property ladder, things will get better for them, and so on. Now, it's entirely understandable to feel like that. After all, as Lynn put it in his reply to the last session, young people in particular, as well as the working class as a whole, have experienced a kind of social recession. So even though there's been growth in Britain, there are more than 500,000 young people unemployed at this point in time. Even though there's been growth in Britain, the number of the people in work who are below the poverty line, the number of families rather that are below the poverty line with their parents in work, has increased by 10% in the time that New Labour have been in power. And of course, average pay last year increased by less than the rate of inflation, that's official inflation, at the same time as real inflation, particularly in food, in fuel and so on, increased far more than official figures suggest. But while it's understandable, it is absolutely not true. Bad as things are at the moment, a slowdown or recession will make them worse. And they will make them worse particularly for young people. It's always those, and of course it's not just young people, it's also migrant workers, other sections of the working class, but it's always the poorest, most vulnerable sections of the working class that suffer first and worst from a recession. If you're in insecure temporary work, if you're an agency worker, you're going to be the first to be laid off when redundancies are carried out in your workplace. Similarly, on the question of the property ladder, even if house prices fall quite dramatically, it will not get easier to get a house because already they're getting rid of mortgages on the kind of extremely favourable terms that existed in the past. And the reality will be in Britain as well as in the US, to borrow money from the banks, they will have to be absolutely certain that you've got the capacity to pay it back. And that means young people with no credit history will not be able to get mortgages. People in insecure unemployment will not be able to get mortgages. But also, young people coming out of university, tens of thousands of pounds in debt, unless they get a really good job, will also have difficulty getting mortgages in the way that they've been able to in the recent periods. And I'd add to that it could become harder for young people to borrow money to go to university. At the moment, you come out up to your eyes in debt, but they let you borrow the money easily. But that would not necessarily be the case as the credit crunch feeds through. And we should be aware, the very fact that most young people at the moment don't know what a recession or slowdown will be like, think perhaps it's not going to be that bad, also means that once it hits them, once the reality hits home, then they are likely to be the most radicalised and the most angry about what it means to them. But of course, we're not suggesting that it is only the poorest, most vulnerable sections of the working class that are affected by economic crisis. On the contrary, even some better off sections of the working class and of the middle class can be affected by recession or crisis. I don't want to repeat all the points that have been made about the US in the previous session. But one of the things that commentators have noticed is whereas in past US recessions, workers kept their house till the very last, this time they give up their credit cards, they keep their credit cards, they keep their cars, their 4x4s, and they walk away from their houses because they know they're not going to be able to afford to keep them. Peter referred to jingle mail, which is people sending their keys through the post. There are websites dedicated it now into the US. Postyourkeys.com, which is telling workers how to get out now because you're going to lose the house anyway and at least get away with your other credit facilities intact. What that means in the US is there will be workers who still have jobs, who are perhaps still driving a smart 4x4, whatever the equivalent is in the US, and yet have literally nowhere to live, or perhaps sleeping in that 4x4 car because there's no social housing or housing benefit in the US. Now, of course, we're not yet in the same situation in Britain, but nonetheless, some of the same things will take place to some degree, and undoubtedly, even sections of the middle class will suffer. You know it's going to be bad when the government and other official spokespeople start to admit it, because generally the position of the government has been whistling to keep their spirits up. Recession, what recession? Britain's a great economy, etc., etc. But Mervyn King, Governor of the Bank of England, has been forced to be a bit more realistic. Whereas comrades would have read, he said blatantly that people have to expect a genuine reduction in their standard of living. When people like him start to say that, you know that a crisis is coming. And like in the US, albeit on a smaller scale, because the British working class has absolutely no savings tucked away for a rainy day, on the contrary, is £1.3 trillion in debt. Britain's consumer indebtedness is greater than the gross domestic product. We owe collectively on our credit cards and mortgages more than we produce as a country. And because of that, it doesn't take much. It can take, for example, just not being able to transfer your credit card debt to a new credit card with 0% interest, like everybody does, swapping from one credit card to another. Relatively minor things like that can tip workers from being able to cope day to day, as they have just about, into a situation where they can no longer pay off their debts. Now, unlike in the US, as Peter commented this morning, we haven't yet hit the point of impact here in Britain as far as the economy is concerned. The younger generation may be oblivious in many cases. Older workers, having experienced recession previously, are certainly worried. They can see the storm clouds on the horizon. But nonetheless, it hasn't had a real impact on their pockets yet. That is still to come. And it's not possible for us to predict the timing, how long it will take to come, or the exact depth of the recession or slowdown that is coming in Britain.